Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for having me here today. So today we are going to be talking about why ancient Egyptian gods look the way they do. So the top results of a Google image search for ancient Egyptian god gives us a glimpse into what most people may visualize when they think about what the ancient Egyptian pantheon looks like. As you can see, some gods take human forms but are clearly divine because of the symbols that they hold or the headdresses that they are wearing. Another well-known type of divine manifestation, which has been popularized in Hollywood films, TV shows, and comics, are what we call hybrid types, which typically feature a god with a human body and an animal head. The ancient Egyptian association of animals with the divine is well known, and many people are familiar that some animals, most notably cats, were considered sacred to the ancient Egyptians. And it's because of this, in some cases, gods can be represented fully zoomorphically. Over the course of ancient Egypt's extensive history spanning millennia, the array of divine forms expanded. And to add complexity to our understanding of divine visualization, certain gods can assume multiple manifestations. So today we're going to explore the context of these divine forms and think about the logic behind their designs. So first we'll talk about the language really quickly. So the ancient Egyptian term for God is Necher, and the earliest version of this hieroglyphic sign dates back to the pre-dynastic period and seems to depict a staff with streamers. This early form undergoes slight variations until reaching its definitive representation in the Old Kingdom, where a strip of cloth is elegantly wrapped around a staff. So modern dictionaries of ancient Egyptian describe the sign as a staff wrapped with cloth or a cloth wrapped around a pole. Jan Osman, the author of one of the most thorough overviews of ancient Egyptian conceptualizations of the divine, suggests that the wrapped staff in early ancient Egyptian religion symbolizes the worship of fetishes. Fetishes are inanimate objects venerated for their perceived powers, and they might be revered to their association with a divine force. The sustained religious significance of a staff with strips of cloth is evident in relief imagery depicting temple pylons with flagpoles erected in their niches. This type of sign is what art historians would call aniconic, or symbolic suggestive imagery, and so not necessarily a literal representation of the divine. So to draw from Jewish and Christian traditions, which may be more familiar, an aniconic holy symbol would be a menorah or the Christian cross. Another early representation of the concept of God is depicted through the image of a hawk perched on a standard, which underscores the importance of animals in Egypt's ancient history. Their veneration was based on behavioral and visual characteristics that the ancient Egyptians would have considered powerful or valuable. For instance, what is more appropriate than the broad-winged falcon to embody a solar deity, a being who resides in the sky? In ancient Egypt, wild and domestic animals could be viewed as protective beings or creatures that could be used to benefit humankind. But the ancient Egyptians, of course, also acknowledged that wild animals could be destructive or even life-threatening. But even with ferocious, dangerous animals, the ancient Egyptians would not have necessarily seen them as pure agents of negative destruction. The ferocity of the crocodile, for instance, would be desirable if one wanted to assert aggressive dominance. And although the cobra spits venomous poison, what better creature could there be to protect the pharaoh? Thus, the cobra becomes a symbol of kingship, which is why they are shown placed on royal crowns and headdresses. So obviously the animal world encompasses a duality, a balance for the ancient Egyptians, and it would be inaccurate to think of any animal to be only good or bad. So as with many things, context is important. Some understanding for the ancient Egyptian conception and visualization of God may be inferred from the development of the hieroglyphic language. We see the word written first as a fetish object, then slightly later as an animal, and then finally to these human form deities. But newer forms of gods did not necessarily replace old ones, and anthropomorphic gods were not necessarily superior or seen as superior to aniconic or zoomorphic forms. Animal gods appear to have been worshipped quite early in ancient Egyptian culture, probably and possibly alongside fetish objects. Meanwhile, the worship of human formed gods appear as early as the pre-dynastic period. Certain pre-dynastic images and figurines have been interpreted as fertility deities because of parallels to other cultural representations of divine female figures and because of how certain parts of these bodies are exaggerated. Clearer evidence of human form deities come a bit later, but still appear quite early in ancient Egyptian pharaonic history during the early dynastic period or Dynasty 0. And it's also worth mentioning that the aniconic star sign, which was used to write the word God, shows up really late in ancient Egyptian history during the Ptolemaic period when the Greeks ruled over Egypt. So rather than adhere to an evolutionary model of divinity, it would be more appropriate to view ancient Egyptian religion as one that embraces and integrates both old and new traditions. Pictorial representations of the gods also sometimes blend and mix aniconic, zoomorphic, and anthropomorphic designs. For instance, the Jed pillar, an aniconic representation of the god Osiris, can incorporate human body parts such as arms, eyes, and legs, which walk, so to speak, the line between being an aniconic and an anthropomorphic representation. So we could call this representation a hybrid type, again, which is a term that we have used most notably in depictions of deities who have human bodies and heads. But here we can also see it blends anthropomorphic and zoomorphic and sometimes aniconic imagery. So obviously the different manifestations and hybridities that are possible is quite overwhelming. And in some cases, we might see a hybrid deity that is composed of more than two creatures, such as Tawaret, the goddess of childbirth and fertility. She is represented as a bipedal hippopotamus with feline paws and limbs and human breasts. So it's important to remember that these artistic representations do not reflect what the ancient Egyptians believed their gods looked like. So to explain, the assigned forms that we see in ancient Egyptian art made the deities recognizable and sometimes identifiable. But when we look at the texts, we see that they are often described as hidden, mysterious, or even unknown. So the implication is that their powers were ultimately greater than what could be defined by images or physical representations. And it's for this reason that gods can appear in many guises. In depictions of Thoth, the god of scribes, learning, and writing, there's considerable overlap in when he is depicted as the ibis bird or the baboon. In hybrid form, Thoth is always represented with an ibis head and a human body. Yves Alone, who's a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, studied one of these, a New Kingdom statue of a scribe from their collection, believing that it provides insight into some of the considerations taken into account when visualizing and representing Thoth. In this scribal statue, a man is shown seated cross-legged on the ground, writing. A papyrus unfolds on his lap and falls over his right thigh, while a baboon squats over his shoulders, holding onto his head. According to Alon, this interplay between the scribe and Thoth as baboon is important in conveying the ideas of divine inspiration and patronage. The writing of Thoth's name in the pyramid texts is followed by this determinative showing an ibis on a standard, and this might suggest that the ibis was the deity's first visualization in ancient Egyptian art. Furthermore, in hymns to Thoth, which petitioned the god to allow one to be skilled in writing and reading, describe him as the splendid ibis. Yet interestingly, in New Kingdom scribal statuary, we see that the scribe is shown embraced by or next to a baboon instead of an ibis. We do have precedents in these depictions of an animal embracing a person's head. So probably one of the most well-known ones is the sculpture of King Khafre, where the wings of Horus, the sun god, seems to protect the head of the king, protecting the reigning monarch of Egypt. The specific arrangement, which is observed initially in the Old Kingdom, recurs in other royal statuary. This includes depictions of kings from the New Kingdom, which coincides with the period in which the Met's scribal statue was made. Despite the expectation one may have of a similar juxtaposition of human and bird in scribal statuary, Alon argues that the artist is conveying subtle messages about the nature of divine influence and power through representing Thoth specifically in this baboon form. Unlike in royal statuary, where Horus's wings may extend over the sovereign without the king's support, the scribal statues present a different dynamic. In the composition at the Met, the baboon is attached fully onto the scribe, holding on to his head and resting on his shoulders. Alon notes that this is far from the depiction of transcendent divine power, which is a quality that might be better expressed with a hovering bird. Alon had also noted that the image of Thoth in the statue might represent Thoth's role as the keeper of the scale during the weighing of the heart ceremony. This ritual, in many books of the dead and in tomb walls, shows Thoth in hybrid form, registering the results of the weighing, proclaiming the results of the tribunal of gods, watching over judgment, and then finally presenting the deceased to the god Osiris. Thoth is also often shown on the top of the scale, though this time not as a hybrid or as an ibis, but as a baboon. And in this capacity, the baboon is scrutinizing the accurate and proper use of the balance, a role that is evoked in the instructions of Amenemope. So neither tilt the scale, nor ruin kite weights, nor decrease the part of the debech measures, neither wish for a debech measures, neither wish for a debech measure of the filed, nor abandon those of the treasury, as the baboon sits near the balance, his heart being the plummet. So in this text, the reader is warned not to interfere with the weighing of the balance, as the baboon is overseeing this whole process nearby. In the context of the Met statue, Thoth is invoked in this baboon form to suggest an association between the scribe and Ma'at, or balance. Hathor is another goddess known for her ability to assume various forms, with a greater multitude of forms compared to Thoth. The specific form Hathor adopts is contingent on various factors, and her diverse manifestations are intricately linked to another characteristic shared by ancient Egyptian deities, the ability to be known by different names. Accordingly, Hathor can take on other animal forms and identities, such as the violent manifestation of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess. She's also sometimes associated with another female goddess, or feline goddess, Tefnut, who is sometimes known as the distant goddess, because of a myth that talks about her fleeing to Nubia, the land south of Egypt. Because of Tefnut's role as the goddess of moisture, her absence resulted in droughts and famine in Egypt. Her eventual return was celebrated annually in ancient Thebes through festivities involving drunkenness, music playing, and possibly storytelling. During these celebrations, nude female figurines were offered, reflecting her role as the goddess of love. Hathor's role as patroness of lovers is also highlighted in the New Kingdom poetry that was produced during this time, such as the Song of the Orchid, which share themes like love sickness and alcohol consumption. These poems all unfold in rich, fertile surroundings, symbolizing the celebration and commemoration of the new year and Tefnut's return to Egypt. Alongside nude female figurines, we also sometimes find cat statuettes offered to Hathor. And this might be a symbolization of Hathor's feline identity. And notably, these are more common in the desert temples dedicated to Hathor, such as the ones at Sarabit el-Karim in the Sinai and Timna in the Negev. According to Geraldine Pinch, this is a strong indication that the cats specifically represent Tefnut as the distant goddess who inhabited the Nubian deserts. These offerings were a way to evoke Hathor's gentle and benevolent aspect and are a testament to how geographical context is considered when deciding on what divine manifestation or representation is most appropriate. The myth of the distant goddess is preserved in the later history of Pharaonic Egypt in Demotic and Greek papyri. The recorded myth explicitly states that Tefnut takes the form of a lioness or a wild cat, creatures that are indigenous to Nubia, which is where she lives until the god Thoth is sent to implore her to come back to Egypt. According to this myth, Thoth in this instance assumes his primate form, a baboon form. It's likely that this part of the myth is illustrated in this New Kingdom limestone flake or ostracon, which many have interpreted to represent how the god Thoth is able to convince Tefnut to return home. In this image, Tefnut is appearing in her zoomorphic manifestation as the divine goddess. She is a lioness that requires appeasement. Meanwhile, Thoth assumes his baboon form. I think a significant detail in this narrative because it might show his role as a voice of reason, reminding us of the equilibrium that the ancient Egyptians seek to uphold. Despite the lack of text here, it's clear from the image that we're not simply looking at a depiction of a baboon and a lion, but we're looking at a divine baboon and a lion. They may initially look like animals, just pure animals in form, because they maintain the shape and general attitude of animals, but if you look carefully, you'll see that they are performing human actions. Tefnut notably holds a stick in one paw, which would be impossible without an opposable thumb. I would not call her a hybrid deity, though, because her hand is not actually human. She's just demonstrating human behavior. So for this, I've coined the term polybehavioral to describe God seamlessly combining zoomorphic and anthropomorphic behaviors. Another compelling example of a polybehavioral god is the great tomcat, which is mentioned in spell 17 of the Book of the Dead. The spell is derived from an earlier coffin text spell portraying the sun god Re as a feline. So the great tomcat plays a crucial role in the spell because it safeguards existence by defeating Apophis, a snake threatening to swallow the sun every night. This additional example underscores the versatility of the polybehavioral concept, demonstrating its applicability across various myths and divine representations in ancient Egyptian culture. It's noteworthy to stress how polybehavioral depictions deviates from the conventional portrayal of animal gods. Normally, animal or zoomorphic gods are rendered as almost indistinguishable from naturalistic, wild, and domestic animals in both form and in behavior. The only characteristics that identify the animal as being divine are the inclusion of attributes like headdresses, for instance, or being shown with offerings, and then also the overall context. So, for instance, the snake in spell 17 is understood to be divine because of its juxtaposition to the mythological text and also its juxtaposition with a polybehavioral god. Additionally, zoomorphic deities are usually depicted with a high degree of formality, in which they're shown striding calmly forward or seated passively. In other words, it does not seem that zoomorphic deities ever display behaviors that are sometimes associated with ancient Egyptian depictions of wild and domestic animals. One exception to this rule of decorum might be the hippo, whose violent, dangerous nature is why is sometimes associated with the god Set, who is also associated with chaos. In this object I'm showing, a king is shown spearing a hippo, which could be interpreted as the king defeating the god Seth, again, who is equated to this violent, dangerous, melodic creature. But it is worth noting a caveat. We have a similar object or an ostracon at the Metropolitan Museum, which depicts the king killing a lion, another aggressive animal. And the inscription on the ostracon reads, "The slaughter of every foreign land, the pharaoh may he live, prosper, and be healthy." So in this case, the hippo might just be a representation of foreign lands or negative power in general, and not necessarily a divine zoomorphic representation of Set. The complexity that we see here highlights the challenges in interpreting animals and their symbolic meanings. Determining the correct reading of an animal requires reliance on formal, symbolic, textual, and contextual clues, a task that is made more intricate by the potential subjectivity of interpretation. Maybe in specific contexts, like in temples, we can more confidently associate the hippo with Set. So again, context is very important. Now, the portrayal of the great tomcat, though engaged in combat with the Apophis serpent, nonetheless maintains a very formal pose, usually reserved for the gods. He's represented hieroglyphically with its tail wrapped around its hind leg. The action that we see here is only implied through its handling of the knife blade. The reason for portraying this action in such a formal manner might be because of the intent to emphasize the righteousness of the great tomcat's violent actions. I want to point out one unique representation of the polybehavioral great tomcat, which is featured in Innerkau's New Kingdom tomb. Like the other images of the great tomcat, we see here a feline seated in an iconic way. One paw is placed firmly on the head of Apophis, while the other holds onto the blade that cuts into Apophis's neck. The great tomcat in this image is particularly aggressive, with snarling mouth and hissing tongue. But its most distinctive feature that many scholars have commented on before are its long ears, which have led to a debate as to what animal we're actually looking at. So are these ears just exaggerations of the natural features of a wild cat, specifically a serval cat, on which these great tomcats were probably modeled, or could it be something else? One scholar, Valériane Jeannot, has argued that the hybrid might be of a cat and a donkey. So she notes the similarity in the ear shape to that of a donkey's in ancient Egyptian art, and adds that the combination of the ancient Egyptian words for cat and donkey, miu and a'a, respectively, make for a very clever rebus or visual pun. So when you place these two words together, they can spell out cat donkey, but a'a also means great, so it could also be the great tomcat. So I'm not rejecting Jeannot's interpretation of her reading of the ears in this image, and the reason why I'm not is because I've already mentioned how varied representations of the divine can be. But I do want to highlight another possibility and what I think is to be the primary layer of hybridization that we could apply to the great tomcat, which is to say that the ears are that of a desert cape hare. So in most depictions of hybrid deities, the separation between different species is a bit clearer than what we see here. So for instance, the god Amnit, the devourer of the dead, is composed of a crocodile, a wild cat, and hippopotamus parts that are distinguished by discrete sections separated by colors and textures. In human and animal hybrids, the morphological transition is also rather discrete, with the headdress or wig creating a distinct division between animal and human form. So these renderings of gods are more like a patchwork of animals and humans, almost like a Frankenstein's monster type creature, which is very different from the seamless hybridity that we see in Intercow's great tomcat or great cat hare, as I like to call it. So this seamlessness and the hybridity of form and behavior that we find in Intercow's depiction of the great cat hare had me think closely about how this approach in design might be dictated by context. So in this instance, there's the possibility that this truly unique representation might be a result of individual artistic creativity, which is evident in other parts of the tomb in which we find this motif. So if we look at Intercow's tomb and look at the ceiling decorations, they're rather unusual patterns. And we also have other details in the tomb that break away from the ancient Egyptian canon of representation, such as this depiction of Intercow seated on a bark, wrapping a piece of linen around his shoulders, and this motif showing the blind harper with squinted eyes and an open mouth. Both these motifs are unusual because commonly the tomb owner is shown as passive as possible. This is to indicate the formality of the setting and his hierarchical standing compared to other people in the tomb. And showing open mouths, even if a figure is singing or speaking, is very rare, even in depictions of the lowest rank of ancient Egyptians. Whatever the reason, it seems that the artist here was very proud of the images that he made because he signed his name multiple times throughout the tomb. So since most ancient Egyptian art is anonymous or unsigned, the fact that we happen to know the name of this artist, Hormin, is quite extraordinary. But why would Hormin depict the great tomcat or as the great cat hare? And why would he choose to depict this hybridity so seamlessly? One reason may be because Hormin was emphasizing some of the physiological similarities of the serval cat and the hare, animals that the ancient Egyptians would have witnessed at a distance in twilight or at night hours out in the desert landscape. Both animals have a tawny colored coat. The darker spots of the serval can easily be confused with the speckled coat of the desert hare. And of course, we see that the length of the serval's ears are especially long, aspiring to reach the length of a hare's ears. There are additional physiological and behavioral similarities between the serval cat and the cape hare that are abundant and which would make this hybridization harmonious. So both animals have front legs with long front legs with muscular hind legs, which means that their silhouettes are very close to each other in appearance when they are sitting up, as we see here, and also when they are striding. And when they are at rest, serval cats and cape hares both place their weight on their hind legs with the paws tucked under the body to look like little bread loaves. So cute. And then also, if we look at the profiles of servals and hares, we also see that they're quite strikingly alike. They both have small yet pointed snouts, and the overall shape of the nose and nostrils are superficially similar. Photographs obviously make the differences between serval cats and cape hares apparent, with many of the features are practically interchangeable when looking at artistic representations, and also when we consider the environment in which the ancient Egyptians would have observed these creatures. So note the similarities here between Senejim's great tomcat and this hieroglyph of a Cape hare. The coloring and the patterning of the coats are nearly identical. They are both golden in color with brown flecks and spots, and they both have a white or creamy underbelly. We also see that they have large hind legs with long forearms. The profiles of the faces are relatively the same shape, and the artist of both these images included the scruffy texture of the fur around the cheeks. The primary differences between these two representations are the ear lengths and the fact that the serval ears are slightly pointier than the more rounded ears of the Cape hare. When we compare the same hieroglyph with that of Innerkau's great cat hare illustration, we see additional similarities in their respective ear shape and length. Here, the great cat hare's ears are rounded slightly, much like what we see in the hieroglyph. They're not quite as long as the ear length of actual and represented Cape hares, but the great cat hare's ears are nonetheless significantly longer than one would expect in a serval cat. They are about a third of the length of its body. Sidney O'Frere has recognized the mythological relationship between hares and felines in ancient Egyptian texts, and like me, assumed that the ancient Egyptians would have recognized the physiological similarities between these animals. He's also noticed how hares and felines are sometimes interchangeable in ancient Egyptian funerary texts. For instance, in one vignette from Ani's Book of the Dead, we see the deceased addressing a group of 3 divinities. One has the head of a hare, the second with the head of a serpent, and the third with that of a bovine. This is a traditional image found in other books of the dead papyri, but we'll sometimes see details modified, such as in the papyrus Greenfield at the British Museum. Here, the hare deity has been replaced with a feline-headed one. So this mixing or hybridization of hares and servals would explain why these animals are interchangeable in the books of the dead, and also provide additional context to spell 17. O'Frere argues that the foundation to this hybridity may be related to astronomical observations of lunar splashes, the shapes of the darker parts of the moon visible to us, and the observed natural behaviors of felines and hares. Imposing meaning and interpretation onto ambiguous shapes is a rather universal desire, because we also have rabbit and hare lunar mythology in many other cultures, including North American indigenous cultures, Aztec culture, the Anglo-Saxon cultures, just to name a few. And then today, perhaps the most well-known myths come from East Asian cultures that interpret the lunar splashes as a rabbit working with a mortar and pestle. So O'Frere suggests that the ancient Egyptians would have also associated these lunar splashes with the hare. And he says that given the similar morphological profile of hares, rabbits, and felines, some Egyptians would have seen a lunar cat instead of, or maybe also in addition to, a lunar hare. So when we look at the development of the goddess Wenet, the goddess of the Hermopolitan hare nome, we find more evidence that felines and hares are closely intertwined. She originally takes the form of a snake, but Wenet eventually adopts a woman's body with the head of a hare, and then later on in the Ptolemaic era adopts a lion's head. Her early possible prehistoric form as a snake is likely rooted in the Hermopolitan creation myth, where we see the god Thoth, a deity who has lunar connotations, creating the Ogdoad. The Ogdoad is a set of 8 gods that consists of pairs of male and female deities who take the form of frogs and snakes respectively, and who represent the chthonic sort of earthly origins of the world. It's worth mentioning that when its name also translates to be the swift one, which characterizes the quick movements of a snake, and also aptly characterizes the swiftness of the Cape hare and the serval cat. These behavioral similarities would have been recognized by the ancient Egyptians. Furthermore, while the serval cat is linked to a solar deity, the hare may have been linked to the moon, not only because of what the ancient Egyptians would have seen in these lunar splashes, but also because hares are nocturnal animals. So the great cat hare combines Hermopolitan and Heliopolitan iconography, solar and lunar imagery, resulting in a hybrid that encapsulates the wholeness of a 24-hour day. The seamlessness of animal forms may have been Hormin's clever way of indicating how day bleeds into night and vice versa. So as a prey animal, the hare may not be the most obvious choice to merge with a powerful and violent image of Re slaughtering Apophis. But hares have powerful offensive and defensive characteristics and behaviors that make the hybridization appropriate. As we have already noted, both the serval and the cat are incredibly fast runners and have large ears, allowing them to detect movement and other creatures from afar. Both animals also have excellent night vision, though the hare is also equipped with the ability to sleep with its eyes open, making it able to attack and counterattack a threat more quickly. And while we might think about hares and rabbits being meek and cowardly, that is a big part of their reputation, in reality, they are quite fierce fighters. There is a reason why Watership Down is so violent, and why medieval manuscripts show hares and rabbits battling knights, and why we have other Book of the Dead vignettes that depict male and female hare-headed deities handling large snakes. Now, these images, you might see them as supernatural or fantastic, but they are based on actual lagomorphic behaviors. I say this partly because I have 2 rabbits and know firsthand, but people throughout history have observed this, and today people have observed this. And for those of you who might be still unconvinced, there is lots of video evidence and photographic evidence of rabbits and hares successfully chasing away and sometimes even killing serpents. Yet the representation of the great cat hare as opposed to the great tomcat, again, is unique to Innerkow's tomb. And again, this might be a testament to Hormin's creativity. It might also be because he's working on a personal tomb that might allow for greater flexibility in iconography. And we also might be seeing an iconographical shift where cats and hares become increasingly intermixed and merged, which might be why in the Greenfield Papyrus, which dates a dynasty or 2 after Innerkow's tomb, we see the cat replacing the hare in the trio of deities facing the deceased. If we interpret Hormin's representation of the great tomcat as a hybrid, symbolizing the sun and moon, we might view his treatment as an example of subtle religious syncretism. This image essentially creates an image of divine beings that merges religious traditions of the cities of Heliopolis and Hermopolis. Though these 2 places had different mythologies and explanations for the workings of the world, their theologies coexisted comfortably in a concept that has been coined as being a multiplicity of approaches, as Eric Horning's idea. And Anna Macy Roth had also noticed that the acceptance of multiple mythologies would explain how certain religious practices, such as burying old cult objects under temple floors, or in the combination of new and old iconographies, to create a motif that is inclusive of both. Religious syncretism often occurs in cross-cultural contexts, especially in polytheistic traditions where the coexistence of many gods is accepted. This blending of religious traditions, practices, and forms results in the creation of a new amalgamated form of belief or worship. Sometimes the syncretism becomes so ingrained in a culture that the memory of this blending is forgotten or fades from collective consciousness. An example from the current season illustrates this phenomenon. Christmas, with its association of wreaths, candles, feasting, and gift giving, draws from traditions associated with Saturnalia, an ancient Roman festival celebrating the winter equinox and the hope of future harvest. As we reflect on these evolving traditions, newer syncretisms become more readily apparent. But predicting how deeply ingrained these syncretisms will be remains uncertain. I don't know. Will we remember the origins of the Hanukkah bush? Who knows? And as Die Hard ascends the ranks of must-watch Christmas films, might Bruce Willis one day personify Santa Claus? Who knows? But turning our attention back to Egypt, I want to say that I've observed notable increase in the visualizations of gods from pre-dynastic times to the end of the Pharaonic period. It's likely that with the establishment of kingship in Egypt in Dynasty 0, that the divinities worshipped along the Nile Valley were placed into hierarchies. And over time, gods from particularly important sites gained prominence, and we see as cultural, religious, and political centers shift over time, that the gods would also rise and fall in importance, and sometimes merge with one another. One of the most well-known syncretisms in Egypt, ancient Egypt, is the merger of the god Amun with the god Ra, forming Amun-Ra. As Egypt's interactions with other cultures increase, gods from outside of the Egyptian pantheon were blended in, usually sharing similar powers or characteristics with the indigenous deities. And artists would skillfully merge these similarities with divine attributes that sometimes reference the diverse origins of these different divinities. I suspect that the growing emphasis on representing divine spaces in material culture contributes to the increased visualization of gods throughout Egypt's history. In the Old Kingdom, the pyramid text provides spells that narrate the king's journey to the afterlife and his encounters with numerous gods. Yet these pyramid texts are completely devoid of imagery. Later, when these texts are incorporated into Middle Kingdom coffins and become the coffin texts, we start to see more images being incorporated, which include representations of divine spaces and of the divine. By the beginning of the New Kingdom, these spells and prayers were expanded upon and collected in books of the dead, which would also be visually rich, or they could at least be visually rich. Books of the dead were written and illustrated on papyri, but could also be illustrated in non-royal tomb settings, and of course also in New Kingdom royal tombs, which were designed and decorated to evoke the king's journey to rebirth. The divinities listed in these religious texts are numerous, and it is in these contexts in which we find the most diverse representations of gods. Minor or lesser known deities are represented in these specific contexts. And many times these gods are referred to as demons, which I want to stress are different from the Judeo-Christian idea of demons, which are primarily seen as negative because of their role as punisher of sins. But demons in the ancient Egyptian context aren't always malevolent. Mainly, Egyptologists use this term to differentiate these beings from the gods, the major gods, to indicate that demons are not necessarily ones who are worshipped, are not ones who have a cult. In my observation, these so-called demons also take more unusual forms than the primary gods, sometimes adopting the features of animals that we don't normally see in the primary ancient Egyptian pantheon. Demons overall tend to adopt more grotesque forms and may combine more than two animals at a time in their formation. But all that said, I approach this classification of these entities with caution, and I do wonder if it's appropriate to use the word demons as we compare them to major deities. And the reason why I do that is because these netherworld divinities exhibit comparable qualities to prominent gods like Osiris, Isis, Hathor, and Thoth. And while their depictions may seem less formal than the gods represented on temples, that doesn't diminish their significance. In fact, they embody some of the more active and protective attributes present in the major ancient Egyptian pantheon. In temple settings, gods are depicted typically in nurturing roles, but the perils of the netherworld demand deities to exhibit more formidable behaviors and to adopt intimidating forms. The choice of the gods' forms in ancient Egyptian art seemed to depend on the mythological narrative being told or the geographical and compositional context of the image. Generally, the ancient Egyptians carefully crafted visual representations of gods to convey their multifaceted nature. The design choices were influenced by the functions these gods served, which in turn were dictated by the specific context in which they were worshipped. So one could argue then that the ancient Egyptians seem to have at least followed a design principle that was coined by the American architect Louis Sullivan, which is that form follows function. Thank you so much for your attention. That is my email if you want to reach me. And I would be happy to take any questions or comments that you might have. Fiat looks. Are there any questions?
I have one. Form and function, syncretism, is that, okay, so you showed the visual form of syncretism, but I guess my question is, what's the motivator? It's sort of like a chicken and egg question.
You could argue that. I mean, I think that's something that people in design also kind of often struggle with too. In this case, I think that with these visualizations, they are trying to emphasize what the god does, though, and so they're thinking about that in the design, which and yeah, you could see that in syncretisms too. So it's something that I definitely need to fine tune, like the preciseness of that language. But I do think that there is something that is there in terms of function being an important design element. Yeah, thank you. And I forgot to repeat the question. I'm sorry. I feel like my answer contextualized what you asked. Yeah. Kind of.
I was getting more motivation.
Okay,
Syncretism is a concept, but what drives it? I mean, is it driven visually in the first place, or is it a visual justification or interpretation of syncretism that's occurred for other reasons, like function?
Right. Okay. So, what are the motivations behind syncretism? Basically, what drives syncretism? I think that really depends too on the particular god you're looking at. Is it syncretism because you are a culture that is coming in contact with another culture, and this is a way to perhaps build bridges or to, form alliances, or is it syncretism because you are um, layering different mythological beliefs, or is it syncretism in the sense that you are creating a god that is maybe has extra powers on top of its supernatural powers? So I think it depends on, I guess, the goal of that. The answer is the motivations are varied. Thank you. Yeah.
A question. A couple of slides from the end, you showed the slide of demons, and a couple of them had their heads backwards.
Right. Yeah.
What's that about?
So I was asked in the slide they showed a couple images ago, which I can't go backwards because of how the PowerPoint recording is working. So um, for those of you watching this later, you can just rewind and take a look at the image of the papyrus of demons. And you'll see that some of them are looking backwards. And that's a great question. I think it's to maybe illustrate, first of all, the netherworld is kind of a weird upside down place and it's sort of backwards, but it might also show, it might be reflective too of the just the perilous nature of the afterlife, having to look all around possibly. It's a good question. And that particular observation that you're making here, I also am just starting to think about. So it could be, I don't know, one of the above, or maybe I'll come up with a different explanation too later. Yeah, Kia.
One of those demons, one of the gate guardians is actually explicitly named, he whose head is turned behind him.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
So in the audience, Kia noted that one of the names of the demons, and they are often named, specifically translates he, I guess, who looks behind him, right? I'm just paraphrasing more simply, but yeah, they often describe how they appear too.
Their names are descriptive.
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes the names can be descriptive, talking about what they do, what they look like. So, and again, it might, and what I think too is that many of these might be reflections of some of the actions that we can associate with the major deities too, but it's sort of like they're a, a different form of them, which is why I'm a little reluctant to make a clear-cut distinction between quote unquote demons and the gods that you find, on big temple pylons, for instance.
I don't. Yeah, it's like a dialect is a language with an army. I mean, you don't know if they made that big distinction.
Yeah, exactly. So who does know? I think it just is, we have to, for us, because we tend to look at this material very discreetly and we're looking at it from outside the cultural context, we want to make these categorizations. It's just in our human nature to do that. But we have to sort of imagine all of these divinities in this organic place that people are interacting with and understanding the different facets of these gods too. It would be helpful, I think. People have mentioned this before. Egyptologists are typically coming from a very Judeo-Christian mindset. So if we started to look at modern polytheistic traditions, or possibly working with Egyptologists who come from those polytheistic backgrounds, maybe we would get a better understanding of what we're seeing in the ancient religion.
That's very true. Any more questions?
Sure. My impression is that a lot of the animals that the gods were shaped on, a lot of them were native, but some weren't.
Right.
Like baboons.
Correct. Yeah.
And I was just curious if you've seen any patterns in terms of the ones that the worshippers probably saw every day versus the ones that they might only see once in a lifetime, if that.
Thank you. Yeah, so the comment in the audience question too is if just the observation that you have some animals that are more native to Egypt and how they're included in, the representation of the pantheon, compared to animals that are foreign, like baboons, which are not native to Egypt too. And have I noticed any patterns there? The only patterns that I have noticed so far is that when you have animals that are, baboons or lionesses, for instance, they are specifically linked to like desert and the periphery of Egypt. So like with the distant goddess myth, for instance, and I'm sure there's probably other examples too, but I would have to really study that a bit more carefully. But I absolutely think that there's something there with that. And, this is one of the reasons why, as I was saying before the talk, I was talking to Jason Silvestri about this, about how I want to do a digital mapping project with my students where we map out where all these different gods are from and where we, where these animals are associated with these different geographical areas. I think that is very important. Yeah, Kia.
So I have a question about the distant goddess. This might be more of a Barbara Richter question, who's not here. But I've read, my understanding is that this is goddess's Hathor, that you think she's Tefnut, and I've also heard that she's Sekhmet. So how does, when is she which one?
So the question was about the distant goddess and how, sometimes she's Tefnut, sometimes she's Hathor, sometimes, what was the last one? Sekhmet, right? Yeah. And when is she which one? And it's a great question. It's one that baffles me too. The Demotic and Greek papyri describe her as Tefnut specifically, but as I've said, the goddess Hathor is kind of understood to transform into these different beings, so they are very interchangeable. So I kind of think it's just like referring to the same god but in different names. But I don't know why. It might be an issue of chronology. It might be an issue too of like where the specific myth is from as well. Yeah, I think it might be regional, and also it might have to do with when the story was written. But yeah, it is confusing, yeah.
Follow up on that, I have not heard that Tefnut took, like a feline form. She is the partner of Shu, is she not?
Yes,
So does Shu get an animal form when she is an animal, or what?
Okay, so the question / observation was that Tefnut, of course, has her consort Shu, and when Tefnut is, adopting the form of an animal, of this lioness, does Shu also adopt an animal form? As far as I know, no. Like, he is not really referenced in this particular. He's just Shu. It's like Ken and Barbie. He's just Ken. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording.